Welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast. This is about connecting industries, technologies, histories, and psychologies to find intersections that can lead to personal and professional growth. Our conversations will be a blend of research, insights, and personal stories, and we hope by listening you become more fascinated about yourself and the world you live in. On behalf of Jay Arjun, this is Arjun Sachdev, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
All right, welcome back to the Rising Laterally podcast. We want to start off again with a big thank you to our listeners. Really do appreciate those of you who have tuned in. And again, a special thanks to those of you who have subscribed. That is really just a tremendous way to help us grow our podcast. If you're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever it may be, please hit that subscribe button or follow and help us grow this thing. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you as well. Jay, I am super jazzed about this episode simply because as I'm talking to more and more people, I simply believe we're about to hit on a wavelength that is really resonating. And that is around folks wanting to be more aware of themselves, their surroundings, folks taking the necessary steps to become more conscious. And so in this episode, we'll touch on a lot of things. We'll touch on, some of the energy, some of the science that goes on around awareness. Will help folks address how to go from a wishing board to actually seeing abundances. We'll touch a little bit on, your projections, your personality, and how that might lead to stereotyping. And then we'll spend a majority of this time talking about how we actually are all connected. Because if you think about it from a basic perspective, awareness is pretty subjective. Like, I know what is going on in my world completely, but when you look at me, you don't know completely what's going on, and I don't know what's completely going on in your world, but we are in the same world. So we have unique awarenesses, but we also have a similar awareness. And I think that this is an episode and a topic that can unite people, and so I'm really jazzed up about it.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I'm really excited as well. We definitely have a lot to cover. I thought it'd be interesting to start with a little bit of science today, just to highlight the fact that, as you brought up, there's a lot outside of our conscious awareness that we're not even really tapped into. There are energies all around us, quite literally, that we can't experience directly. So I wanted to start by going back to middle school science class here and first look at light. So if you look at the spectrum of light waves that are visible to humans, it's really just a very small sliver of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Across the spectrum, you have radio waves, microwave waves, infrared, visible, ultralight, X-rays, gamma rays, and we only see that small spectrum of light waves ranging from about 450 nanometers in wavelength to about 700 nanometers in wavelength. That's blue to red. That's based on the way that the cones in the back of our retinas perceive light. So, theoretically, we could have evolved to see something like infrared, which would mean if you were looking in the mirror and in a dark room, you would see yourself glowing back at you. But given the fact that we didn't evolve the ability to pick up on that wavelength, we're totally blind to infrared rays, which I think is pretty interesting. And, I think, if you think about the fact that those wavelengths are still being produced by our body, they're still out there, and certain animals and certain, pieces of technology can pick them up. It shows to you that, there are things that are beyond our awareness that are around us all the time. Same thing with something like water. I think most people would agree that distilled water is tasteless. And again, evolution comes into play here. We evolved to cancel out any taste in water because we wanted to be able to detect the slightest impurities, to know if it was contaminated, it might have something that would harm us. So there may be, a species out there that is not water-based, not on this planet, but on another, that would perceive water entirely differently and actually pick up a taste in water that we can't. And then finally, I wanted to talk quickly about the idea of pheromones. A pheromone is a secreted or excreted chemical factor that triggers a social response in members of the same species. So pheromones are essentially chemicals that are capable of acting like hormones outside of the body of the person who's secreting them, or the animal who's secreting them, to impact the behavior of the receiving animals or individuals. So they can play a large role in mating and attraction. They can even be used by animals to alert others around them of danger. And the really interesting thing here is this is all happening on a subconscious level. So we're still figuring out the extent to which humans give off pheromones, but the important point is that we do not perceive them consciously like we do perfumes or fragrances. They're affecting the human nervous system on a subconscious level. So the picture that I'm just trying to paint with all of this is that when it comes to our sensory awareness of the world, we only have a very limited view out, and we know this empirically. So, I think we should apply that same humility around the fact that we have a subjective, constrained view of the world, the physical world, in the way that we think about our view out in the psychical or psychological world. Like in the same way that we can only see a sliver of visible light, in terms of our optical capabilities, there may be things about other people, their personalities, our personality, that are beyond our perception or our awareness. And I think what we're trying to do is kind of bring some of that out and help people become maybe more aware of those elements that are at play psychologically.
So, do you have any thoughts that you may want to pull off of that as to why you believe we evolved specifically that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we evolved we evolved capabilities that helped us in our survival. So if you think about something like, X-rays, X-rays are kind of ever present in the universe. They're coming down from space at all times. If we were aware of X-rays, it would make it really hard for us to see much of anything else. We'd kind of be overwhelmed. So, the human eye was like, I need to be able to see what color the fruit in front of me looks like to be able to tell if it's good to eat or not. I need to be able to see like the colors of the trees on the horizon so I know how much distance I have to cover. I think we filtered out everything that wasn't immediately necessary from an evolutionary perspective. And it's great because, it got us where we are. But, now that we have the science to understand how much other things are out there that could be perceived, it's important to have that humility around the fact that we're looking through a very narrow window.
That's true. That's true. And part of that narrow window is ego, and ego getting in the way of actually being able to unblock your access to some of these unseen or unfelt energies. And that is something that, boils down to your ability to actually manifest. And so to think about going from wishing to think about going from a vision board to actually feeling abundances, I'm going to lean on some of the research work done by Lacy Phillips. I started listening to her Expanded podcast. And I think that when you think about manifestation and make it part of your vernacular, it is the solution that's going to bridge the gap for you. But it requires you to be super active when you're looking to unblock and expand yourself. You have to be able to actually learn that whatever you're wishing for or looking for on that vision board can actually be done and that you're capable of doing it. So one of the ways to start expanding and reaching into some of the energies that you may not be able to see or feel is to start to surround yourself with people that are doing what you're doing. So for example, if you want to start to own a business, or if you want to become an author or anything along those lines, the way to start expanding yourself is to include those types of peoples, because then your mirror neurons in your brain can start to mimic that it's possible for you. So you have to have certain people around you. That energy allows you to start mirroring and allows you to reflect that you can grow into what you want to be. So you have to believe it. Then you actually see it by having the people around you actually doing what you want to do.
Interesting. Yeah, that brings to mind to me the idea of the sociological idea of the reference group, and basically it's a framework that assumes that an individual's attitudes and values and the way they review themselves, the sort of benchmark they hold themselves up against, will be largely defined by the people that they're surrounded with. So I think it is important to ask yourself, are you surrounded by the right people based on what you want? Because
exactly.
So I mean, so I guess go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, because that's so key, because the people around you can actually provide the gray. So when you start to manifest and you make it part of your life, you're actually in full communication with the universe. So if there are people around you who don't actually fully believe in your manifestation work, or that you're trying to create something and you have a clear intention, they can actually start to input those gray areas. So one important thing is to be able to set boundaries for yourself. So if I give a personal example around, leaving a corporate job a few months ago. The only people who had fear for me was my immediate family. But that was because they were trying to be supportive and they were trying to look out for me. They're saying, hey, you're going to leave an income, you're going to leave a job, there's no medical, all that stuff. And so in a way that's supportive, but in another way, it's not, because that fear from them doesn't allow me to actually be able to let in the clear intentions and the clear energies and have those play out. So it's not them who decides what my path is going to be. It's me deciding that it is the universe. And then you create, by bringing in those expanders I was talking about, they help you to go down a path. And then you end up like actually having this ability to set the boundaries and actually start manifesting and get rid of fear.
Totally. Here's a question. What would your advice be to someone that has a very clear idea of what they want to manifest? They have confidence in their own ability and their own work ethic, but maybe unfortunately they're not surrounded by even any a single person who believes in them or can be that person that they can feed energy off of. How much can we dig up that energy from ourselves until we need someone to support us in order to generate more?
I think a lot of it is yourself, and this requires a lot of active work. And sometimes even if you have no one around you, you still have your ego. And ego can work in two different ways. It's either going to work against you because you just want external validation. You're going to quickly learn that that's not going to work. Or if you are on a path and you have a clear vision and you have a clear intention in your mind, gut, body, soul, and you're doing it for that reason, and there's a true calling, then you're not going to be knocked down on your lying path. And so, there is a lot that's going to come from within you. It's just a matter of whether or not you're lying to yourself or actually true. And I just think that, again, getting rid of fear, setting boundaries, whether it's with yourself, your ego, or the people around you, you have to do it, because if fear sets in, then the inner dialogue associated with fear, like, it's not only being afraid, but then you start to think about, like, I'm not worthy enough or I'm not good enough. And then that energy of fear, even if it's from the outside, is what's holding you back. And I want to be clear, like, this doesn't mean you have to be 100% positive all the time. It's just that you have made an agreement with the universe that it's more about your actions rather than your thoughts. So start to ask yourself, okay, what the hell am I doing today that is fearless and in clear line with my stated objectives of what I'm trying to manifest? Because once those negative thoughts get out and you get rid of fear, you start to build trust in the universe and that energy, and that starts to build momentum, and the universe loves that energy. So you have to be aware of the universe inside of you and the universe outside of you.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that really landed with me there too is the fact that your ego could work for you or against you. It brings to mind this video I was watching on Buds, which is the one of the required sort of trial by fires to become a Navy SEAL. It's the basic underwater demolition training, and I think I'm getting that right. But I remember one of the lieutenants who was running the program, I think he was a former Navy SEAL, said that of the people, it's an incredibly grueling program, but of the people that go into it wanting to do it so they can say they're a Navy SEAL and go back home to their hometowns and flex on everyone, none of those people get through. But of the people that go into it with the intention of serving and of doing it, for their fellow brothers and sisters in arms, like the people that are drawing from that kind of ego and that kind of energy, they actually can complete this incredibly difficult program successfully. So I think you're absolutely right.
Absolutely. How would you tie in, like Freud and Jung into this conversation? Because if you're talking about consciousness, those two names are going to come up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I mean, one of the big things that we have to give both Freud and Jung credit for was discovering the subconscious and the unconscious. I think Freud had originally coined it as the subconscious, and then went on to call it the unconscious because he thought that was a better name for it, because a lot of these things that these forces he was talking about were not just, lower within our conscious structure, they were completely out of what we were aware of. That's what Jung and Freud are really trying to get at. Like there are psychological forces at play constantly within us that we're not even in the slightest bit aware of. And I think, a lot of psychotherapy was the project of trying to help people recenter themselves by, figuring out what was bothering them deep down in their unconscious, bringing it up, resolving it, integrating it into their personality, and then moving forward with a better understanding of both, their waking life and their unconscious as well. So I think, maybe one of the directions we can go in is just kind of talking about the unconscious in general, maybe a little bit the difference between how Freud saw it and how Jung saw it, and kind of talk about maybe how we feel we've interacted with it in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to get a sense of how you see it too, personally. Like, what's the JB perspective on
Nice.
this?
Nice.
But
Nice.
yeah, I mean, Freud. So Freud, from what I understand, he was thinking about the unconscious as it being a product of your personal experiences. Jung, on the other hand, was talking about it in the sense of it being inherited from just our past collective experience as humanity. What I also find interesting is that at one point these two worked together. Like Freud and Jung were working together, and a lot of what Jung was doing was actually like validating Freud's thoughts. And then over time, they actually started to split and how they were thinking. And now you think of them as two different people, but at one point they were actually working together, which I find interesting. But
Yeah.
right. So with Freud, he tried to make it super simple. He came up with the visual. You were touching on it. It's the iceberg. You got the conscious as the first layer that you see. Then you got the preconscious and you got the unconscious. Conscious being what you actually know is happening. The preconscious is what we call memory. You're not currently thinking about your personal email address, but because I just mentioned it, you can access it quickly, almost as quickly as I just accessed your second layer of the mind, by the way. And then it's the unconscious, where most of what happens in the mind is occurring. But what happens in this layer is influencing your feelings, your behaviors, your biases, and your judgments. And it's just being stored, and it's coming from your past experiences.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So Freud was very, Freud and Jung for quite a while was Freud's protege. I think the first time they had met, Jung took a train, I think from Switzerland to Germany to meet Freud, and they had like a 16-hour conversation in their first interaction, which shows you how smart they were and how much their thinking overlapped. But Freud was very narrowly focused on childhood. He was focused on sexual development and like sexual impulse as like the most important psychological force. And as you mentioned, he kind of coined the idea of the subconscious and the unconscious, but he was very narrowly focused on the personal subconscious. And Jung was like, okay, I agree with some of this, but I think there are a lot more psychological factors at play than you're really identifying, Freud. So he coined the idea of the archetype, and there's tons of different archetypes, warriors, magicians, fathers, mothers, kings, tyrants. So he was, without going too far into it, he thought that there were characters and personalities embedded in our psychological structures that had, a ton of impact on the way we see ourselves and the types of energies we're tapping into and the type of energies that we have an affinity for. Some people tend to embrace more of that warrior archetype throughout their life, tend to be more aggressive, more kind of decision oriented, more assertive. And then other people may, embody more of like the magician archetype, or, the magician personality. They're more creative, they're more open-minded. So that's a kind of really simplistic primer. But I think the reason why I definitely agree with Jung over Freud is because Jung just had like a much richer, I think, interpretation of how far-ranging the human psyche is. And as you mentioned earlier, he, with his idea of like the collective unconscious, he really tapped into the same thing that I think evolutionary biologists tap into when they try to figure out, how our systems work based on how they evolved over time. So, you look at something like the circulatory system, which was constructed and honed over generations by evolution, you know, in the same ways that that physical system is honed and cultivated over the generations by evolution and by time, you know, Jung would argue, so are our psychic structures. So we know that like the circulatory system is as old as 520 million years old. I guess the first fossil containing a heart and blood is traced back to 500 million years ago. But, you know, Jung would be asking the kind of same question around like, okay, how old is fear? Like, how old is aggression? How old is, to Freud's point, sexual impulse? Or how old is love? How old is grief? How old is tribalism? And, you know, the further back you go, the deeper the emotion gets. So I think there's just much more for me to relate to in Jung's perception of the unconscious and the collective unconscious than there is with Freud.
Same. I would put myself in Camp Jung as well. I mean, think about
Nice.
this. Yeah. Well, I just love the fact that he's talking about that all humans share, are connected because of this ancestral experience. And the fact that he was talking about this and he wrote about it first in 1916, and we're sitting here in 2020 and still having this kind of conversation, I find it remarkable. And out of the archetypes, I think it's interesting. He found that the mother one being like the most powerful one or the most important, because not only is it your mother and your grandmother, but it is also the garden, the plowed field, the earth, the sea, the woods. So the way he thinks about it and the way he expresses it, I'm in line with it. And, you know, one example for, you know, just to think about, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, but have you ever wondered about the similarity and universality of world religions? I mean, Jung was convinced that religion is a manifestation of the collective unconscious.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's also where he thought you can get fairness, right, wrong, ethics, morals from as well. It's part of our collective experience. And just to put this in perspective, if you really want to get heady here, do some ancestral math. In order for you to be born, you need 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 great grandparents, 32 third great grandparents, and you can go on and on. 64, 128, 256. Next thing you know it, you're at 2,048 ninth great grandparents. And let's just stop there. So if you were born today based off of that ancestry, that's taking you across 4,000 ancestors over hundreds of years. So think about their struggles, their battles, their difficulties. Think about all the times they were happy. Think about all the times they showed love. Think about all the times they hoped for the future. They needed to go all through that for you to exist.
Yeah, it's insane. It's insane. You think about how many generations had to like successfully procreate. Like we are the descendants of like 3.5 billion years of like successful procreation. Like if you talk about the human resilience, you know, it's like that's pretty incredible, especially given the odds that people were up against, you know, throughout history. And this is, you know, that's not humans. It's, you know, including all of like the cellular life on Earth, but they were up against, you know, they were fighting an uphill battle just to make it to the next iteration of life as well. So, you know, we're kind of like the distillation of all of that pain and suffering and triumph and courage, you know, in a really kind of complex life form, both physically in terms of, you know, our mechanical bodies and in terms of our psychological structure. So yeah, no, it's just absolutely incredible, man.
Yeah, and you know, again, just tying it back to Jung and his theory of the collective unconscious, he thinks that explains how fears and social phobias can manifest in people, whether you're an adult or a child, for no apparent reason. And so that might explain why people, you know, go to a social event and they struggle. It's maybe a form of projection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, but I think projection is a really important thing to talk about. And honestly, it's a very useful thing, I think, for people to be tapped into, because your projections might be defining your perception of people, not only the people that you meet at parties, but the way maybe you're thinking of someone in the opposite political party as your own, the way you may be thinking of someone, of a different religion, like a world away, or even the way that, you may be thinking of people that are close to you in your life, like your parents or your siblings. So I think to give a little bit of a primer here on projection, it was again coined by Freud, but he thought of it very narrowly. He thought of it as sort of a defense mechanism that people used in order to cope with their own difficult feelings or emotions they didn't want to deal with. So instead of, they would basically project their own undesirable emotions onto other people instead of admitting that those were their own feelings. So, if you're like competing for, a job or a promotion and someone else gets it for you, maybe you were in that situation when you were going for that promotion, you were kind of power hungry, really wanted the status, wanted the prestige. And then when the other person gets it, you're like, well, they're power hungry. They just wanted the prestige. Like, you write them off by taking the emotion that you didn't want to identify in yourself and putting it on the other person from the standpoint of protecting your own psychology. And again, Jung really opened that whole idea like wide into like a much sort of more capacious understanding of what projection could be than Freud did. So Jung thought more of projection as like anything, any interaction where you're projecting your own history in the world onto other people. So if you've ever been betrayed, then you may be more distrustful of people. If you've ever, been abused, you may see people as greater like physical threats than they are. So instead of it being just a defense mechanism, and instead of it just narrowly being, a projection of the unwanted feelings you have, it's just basically any time where you're going into a situation with someone and presuming information about their character based on your prior experience with other people or prior experience with the world. So it's really anything that you impute onto another person that's not actually based on the evidence gathered from your interactions with them, which I think we're doing all the time. His point was like, this is the most prevalent psychic phenomenon. Like, anytime you meet someone based on maybe a t-shirt they're wearing or their age or where you hear they're from, like, you're probably assuming things about them that are not based on the evidence that's available to you in that interaction with them. So I think it can lead to sometimes being surprised, to the upside with people. It can sometimes lead to becoming disenchanted with people later on if you projected positive things onto them that turned out not to be true. But I think, by and large, you'll live a more objective life if you're trying to constantly keep your own projections in check and ask yourself, is that person actually that way? Or am I just making an assumption based on my life experiences or what viewpoints have been fed into me?
So as you think about people trying to be more aware, would you say that like you need to start going more with the flow of situations and feel the energy?
Yeah, I think I think you want to, in terms of like feeling the energy, I would like feel whatever energy is actually like present. Like, if
Exactly.
someone's being like, if someone's being rude to you, you don't have to like second guess your projection and be like, oh, maybe I'm just projecting onto them as a rude person. If they're being rude, they're being rude. But if there's like nothing objectionable they're doing, but you still have a feeling of ill will towards them, it's like, you got to check yourself. Like, is that something they're doing, or is that something your own mind is doing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So let me ask you a riddle. If you can figure it out, that's great. But so a father and his son are in a car accident. Father dies at the scene. The son is really badly injured. He's rushed to the hospital. They're in the operating room. He's in the operating room. The surgeon looks at the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son.
I actually have heard this, so I don't want to give myself more credit, but it's I think the idea was that the doctor was the mother, right? But most
Exactly.
people thought
Exactly.
of doctors being, oh, I remember when I was 10 years old, that riddle stumped me, man. And that was probably partially due to my age and partially just due to it being a different time. You know what I mean?
I think it's because the unconscious is associating males with professional roles more strongly than it does for women. And so I think a lot of what goes on is simply hidden biases. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you want to have a book recommendation, I would put out Blindspot, Hidden Biases of Good People. I think it touches on some of the things you're talking about around projection, around stereotyping, but you have to realize like your brain is an unconscious warehouse that's full of associations that it's been taking on from different inputs. And these are ingrained habits of thought there, and they actually lead to errors of how you perceive, how you remember, how you make decisions, how you project, and how you reason. And so these are things called mind bugs, where we create associations constantly in response to what's going on in the media, what's going on with any of the cultural narratives that are out there. And so we start to link all of this, and that affects our perception of people, whether it's based on their race, their weight, their gender, or their sexual orientation. And so it's just because we're human, we have this brain, and all it's doing is it's operating in the unconscious, like we've talked about. But it's these unconscious little hidden associations that cause us to act out of sync with our conscious values. And these are the blind spots, right? And so that's why like we have to just accept one thing, and that is that social differentiation exists. Humans are really, really good at categorizing and instantly developing stereotypes. It's an implicit bias, but it's pervasive. So one thing that maybe we can do as we all try to be more aware is to stop categorizing. And maybe one of the byproducts of that would be a reduction in stereotyping.
Well, so how would you recommend handling the problem when it seems like a lot of it is bubbling up from the unconscious? It's something that people need to check themselves on, but how can you do it if you don't really have the mirror to turn around on yourself and see exactly what you're doing, because it feels just natural because it's coming up from your unconscious? And I don't mean like overt discrimination, but I mean, the ways in which we harbor biases towards others that, we're not even really aware of.
So I think there's two ways of answering this. One is, let's say you've reached adulthood and you are going through the process of becoming more aware. Then, good people are going to discover these blind spots, and then they're going to naturally want to change, and they'll just be motivated. But the real work needs to be done at the baby development level, because what happens there is that studies have shown that humans just have a preference for the familiar. So you're going to identify with the same race. And so I would say one technique would be to put a baby in front of as many different faces as possible, and not just your own race. I think that would be a huge thing. Expose them to different backgrounds, because what happens if you don't is it's very easy for your brain to create an in-group versus an out-group. And if that becomes imprinted way too early, then it's not like you're going to see like implicit acts of aggression towards the out group, but it's more going to be like there's going to be small everyday acts that keep helping the in group. And that's the type of hidden, subtle, implicit bias that exists just at the ground level with all of us. And if we can somehow at the baby development stage expose them to different backgrounds, maybe that could eliminate some of the stereotypes over time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that would be a pretty useful solution. I think you're absolutely right. The earlier you can get to it in terms of people's development, the more of an impact it will have on their unconscious. So instead of getting to adulthood and having to constantly question their conscious behavior and how it may, be being influenced by your unconscious behavior, the ideal solution would be to just get to the root of the matter and cull those biases out of the unconscious, which will be quite an undertaking. But I think you're absolutely right. The younger we can start with kids, the better.
And maybe that starts with some shadow work.
Yeah. So you're going back to Freud and Young here, which I'm excited about. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the shadow, was sort of discovered by Jung, and his conceptualization of it's basically like anything that parts of your personality that exist in your unconscious that you're not aware of. And for the most part, for most people, they tend to be negative parts of the personality because we would rather not admit to them being parts of our personality. You could certainly have someone who has like positive personality traits in their shadow, but there would probably be less of a, less reason for them to try to push those positive traits in the unconscious. It's typically like the unsavory parts of human behavior that we try to pretend we have no part in. So that's how those more negative aspects end up in the unconscious. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, like going back to our comments around how old we are, just as we're the descendants of, mothers and children, like we're also the descendants of people that have, fought tooth and nail and have been hyper aggressive and hyper violent and have done, terrible things to other people. And that's, embedded in us as well. And I think, being aware of that well, the way that I think about it, like, when people say like, are you a good person? I think if your immediate answer is yes, then like you haven't really done a lot of shadow work. Like you should at least have to pause and think about it. If you want to be able to say that you've dug into your unconscious.
Yeah, man. It's like if you're saying yes so quickly, or if you're only looking at good things, you're lacking depth.
Totally.
You you have to look at the dark side, man. That's how you actually get the balance. That's how you can actually get some joy and peace in your life. And honestly, if you're not looking at your shadows, you are at risk of being stuck in a scarcity mindset. You're putting yourself at risk of falling to addictions. You're putting yourself at risk of, constantly telling yourself you're not worth it, or, that you don't deserve things. And you're just going to get these health issues as a result of it. And it doesn't allow you to manifest anything. Like your shadows are what's blocking you. It's what's clearly in the way of what your actual outcome could be. Like you need to be looking at your shadows, and that's how you manifest. It's also energy work. Like think about whatever is the opposite of whatever you're conditioned to do right now. And if you start to really look at that, then you can start to pick what patterns and behaviors are going to serve you well and which ones are not going to serve you well moving forward. And that's how you increase your own self-awareness. So you have to start looking at some of the barriers in your life. But the key, I think, is that you really can't be so hard on yourself. You have to show compassion for yourself in this process and compassion for the world around you. But I would say that if you're not fighting your greatest battles, then how are you walking around saying that you've reached your peak success or potential?
Totally. Yeah, man. I think I think the most important battle is the one that's fought within. And unless you understand your shadow, you will never like fully understand yourself, because that is a big part of the whole composite of your personality. And, ultimately I think there are a lot of useful things in the shadow. Like I think there's some people that, are so averse to confrontation that they take all the aggression that is a natural part of their personality and hide it away in their shadow. And then, they're in a situation where they can't ever confront people or stand up for themselves when they need to. And, being able to draw that up and learn how to like show your teeth a little bit. It doesn't mean that you need to invite conflict or invite violence, but having exercised that muscle, it's an important part of self-realization and becoming as powerful in a positive way as you could be.
Absolutely. The thing is, we're all connected. I mean, we all have triggers. We all have anger at some point. We all are lazy at some point. We all have some sort of insecurity. We all may place blame on others at times. Like we all go through these things. Like we are definitely connected. And it's just a matter of us as a society wanting to put the effort into actually getting to know people.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. And I think the fact that we're, we've gone through this big massification where you have thousands of people all living in some situations, millions of people all living in communities together, has kind of like corrupted our ability to recognize other people as three-dimensional people. When you see my face, or when you see when you see my face, you see skin, you see eyes, you see hair, you see a nose, but
You're a
you
good
don't
looking guy,
see.
bro.
Thank you, man. You too. But you don't see the inner life of my experiencing being, right? Like you just see the icon of what I am. Like you don't directly see my thoughts, emotions, perceptions. You don't see that whole network of experience. And when you look at someone's face, you're deceived a little bit because it tells you a lot about their inner experience. But those tears that may be on a sad person's face, like they're not actually sadness itself. They're just markers of sadness. They're just salt and water. So, I think in a lot of situations, what I'm trying to get at is that we don't see the soul behind the icon that is the face and that is the body. And, if you wanted to use a metaphor here, the face and the body is the icon to, is to the Internet Explorer icon to what the soul is to the whole internet, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
oh yeah. Oh yeah, that makes me want to double click on the icon, double click into a person. I think when you start to double click into a person, you can then see more of yourself in other people. And that's how you create the connection that we're all related. We're all part of a larger collective. I mean, it's like,
Absolutely, man.
yeah, because it's important to get to know people because things mean different things to different people based on their inputs of their entire life. So I can say a word or I can have a thought and it could be meaning one thing to me and a completely different meaning to you.
Totally.
Right? So one of my favorite things I used to do, and it would just get me the most incredible blank stare back where I knew I was looking into their brain, I was looking into like their soul, and I was creating an instant connection. And it would be like I would be out at a festival or out at a large gathering, and I would see a group of people, and I would go up to them and be like, "Yo, like think about this. You just lived your entire life, your entire journey, all the good days, all the bad days, all the birthdays, all the soccer practices. Think about all the classes you attended or didn't attend, all the parties, all of those travels. And for some reason, we're standing right here on this planet at the same coordinate at the same exact time. It
I've seen
just,
you do that. I've seen you do that to people, and they are slack-jawed.
yeah,
I've seen
dude.
you do that to multiple people at the same time, and they all they all want to get in on the conversation. Yeah, dude, I know, and that's double clicking, and that's looking into people and engaging with the soul, if you want to call it that, and not just the body. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Because that helps just break all the ice, and you instantly realize it's all about love, bliss. There's no judgments. This is about a feeling of equality. This is about a feeling that we're all being acknowledged. And it's like, it really makes a difference when you double click into people.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think people aren't expecting it, dude. People don't like expect to be treated like a human anymore. I imagine, and I don't really know much of the history here, but like I imagine, 150 years ago when we were all living in like really small towns, there'd be like one guy in the town who was making shoes, and he's a cobbler, and he maybe made shoes for the whole community and saw like one or two people come in a day. And I'm sure like when they came into a store, he saw them as a human, he or she saw them as a human, and they saw him as a human. And now we're in the situation based on how far life is accelerated, where most of life is like very transactional. Like a person,
Mhm.
like a cashier working at McDonald's, they're not going to see like one or two customers a day. They're going to see like 150. And I think it becomes harder and harder to treat every one of those 150 people to, like the rich network of experience they are. You kind of just see them as like one icon after another. You know what I mean? And some of that,
Absolutely.
that's just the world we live in. But to your point, I think when you can make a conscious effort to double click into people, even though it sometimes takes more energy, you know, it's worth it, man. It's where it feels good and it'll be appreciated on the receiving end.
Absolutely. I mean, look, why do you think we were placed on this planet?
Dude, that's a big question. I think I mean, in the simplest terms, I think that we came from nothing and nothing wanted to experience what something was like.
Mm,
So
so,
there was like a hunger for life built into this nothingness. And I don't know how it managed to do it, but it was able to become aware of itself first as like very, very first as just cellular life, and then as like really, rudimentary, like primeval organisms. And then, you escalate that all the way up to what we have now. Like, we're quite literally from the earth, we're of the earth. Like when we go to festivals, that's the earth enjoying a festival. Like when we
oh
marry
yeah.
each other, that's the earth marrying itself. And I think there was some drive for experience and for for everything too, for the good parts and for the bad parts. And going back to the
Yeah.
shadow, like, the earth didn't just create this like blissful utopia where nothing bad happened. It created like, this great theatrical production of heroes and villains and like good and evil. And I think it just, wanted to, going back to our last episode, create a awesome story to participate in.
Yeah, man, it's an amazing miracle. Do you know who Alan Watts is?
I do, yeah. I've rediscovered him recently. He's got some great stuff on YouTube.
No, does he? I need to check that
Yeah.
out. Yeah. So he's a British writer. For those of you who don't know, he is a writer and a speaker, and he interpreted and popularized Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism to the Western audience. But he has an incredible quote that goes hand in hand with what you just said. And what he said was, through our eyes, the universe is perceiving itself. Through our ears, the universe is listening to its harmonies. We are the witnesses through which the universe becomes conscious of its glory, of its magnificence.
That's super powerful. Super, super powerful. Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, I'm so tapped into that idea. Do you think that listeners or people that maybe haven't thought about it really understand the profundity of that comment? Because I read Hierarchy in Heaven and Earth. That whole book was basically about that point, about how the Earth was able to turn an eye on itself via animal and human life. And I think it's important for people to understand, like, that's very much like an empirical argument. It sounds like woo-woo spiritual talk, but like, no, that's, if you, there's nothing scientifically debatable about that. Like the cellular life came from, well, if we want to go back further, like planets came from stardust. Cellular life came from the rock that made up the planets. Animals came from cellular life. Humans came from animals. Like, we are part of an unbreakable chain reaching all the way
Exactly.
back to those stardust particles. And like, if it sounds silly, it's because it kind of is. It is a little like ludicrous that all of this came from something so elementary, but that's what's so exciting about it,
Absolutely. And maybe this will help the audience if they're still in that camp that doesn't believe it. A lot of, who's pretty popular is Eckhart Tolle. Like he is a pretty popular writer, and he's actually credited with saying the following. He said, "You are not in the universe. You are the universe, an intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself." What an amazing miracle. So if, just to let you know that there are really prominent thinkers that are thinking through this right now. And, scientists have discovered that everything in the universe is vibrating. You vibrate with your own heartbeat. All things vibrate differently though. Like sometimes you can't feel or sense the vibrations of a rock or a tree, but you sense it of a buzzing bee.
Mm-hmm.
And so one argument may be made that, humans were created to be the caretakers of Earth. We were placed on this planet in order to care for the animals and the plants. And we're supposed to be here to show respect and gratitude for all of the abundance that Earth is providing. Because again, we're all tied to that idea of cycles, right? Breathing, my heartbeat, the way I sleep, seasons, flowers opening and closing their petals, rain, sun, birth, death, patterns, bird migrations, us orbiting, like all of that, it's vibrations. And
Totally. Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing, just to point people to another person. His name is Arkan Lushwala. He wrote a book called The Time of the Black Jaguar. And he wrote in that book, quote, humans were created with the mission to care for the rest of creation through the power of their heart and their capacity to produce refined vibrations. Keeping this memory alive in their heart and singing it back to all that lives became their gift, their mission, and the foundation of a beautiful way of life. We are responsible for all of the vibrations on Earth. It's on us, people. It's on us.
Totally, man. No, totally. It's an incredible responsibility. Like, you know, I mean, there's a lot of ways to go with that, but I think there are people that think of, there's a sort of like false dichotomy of like, if people don't believe in afterlife, they don't believe that, they think that that means humans are just animals. It's like, you know, well, if you don't believe in like the eternal soul, then what are you arguing, that humans are just animals? It's like, no, that's not, it's not that we're just animals. It's that I don't believe in the afterlife, but it's like, it's that we're not gods, but it doesn't mean that we don't have something very special that's elevated above animals. The fact that we have art and music and these rich relationships, like, you know, even though I don't believe in afterlife, you know, I have a deep spirituality around all that and a feeling that, like, yeah, there is something markedly different about humans than the rest of the animal kingdom. And it is a hierarchy and we are at the top of it. And, you know, that does, you know, come with a certain responsibility that we've obviously like totally lost at this point. And I don't mean to point the finger because, like, you know, I'm part of the whole system that is engaged in Earth's destruction. But, you know, I think like after you go through a lot of this work, it becomes more and more painful to realize like what we're doing to the planet, and even just realize what we're doing to each other. It's like this is like not what we're supposed to be doing right now.
Dude, our ego gets in the way of us thinking that we're better than every other plant or animal out there. The reality is that, again, we're supposed to be the caretakers. And
Totally.
we're, you know, if like we don't protect Earth, it's not going to protect us back. And so like if we had to grade ourselves as caretakers, we're like almost at the F range, you know what I mean? We're almost failing. How much more can we take from Earth before we start giving back? And because of this greed, right, we call it business, we call it globalization, we're actually losing our forests. We're losing the indigenous people, you know, those ancestors that carry this type of wisdom and rely on the Earth for their survival. We're losing that. We need to start mirroring like those types of frequencies. You know, those things like, you know, those tribes, they dance, they sing, they carry love, they're grateful. All of that increases the vibration of the planet. And so it's like we need to reconnect with the universe and the Earth. And honestly, if we leave these or if we lose these tribes and indigenous people, your boy might be out there dancing and learning some of these songs. And the point is, like, who's gonna honor the ground? Who's gonna honor the plants? Who's gonna honor the animals?
So no, it's I point taken. I think like, so I think we went through a period with religion where it became so much of an institution that people felt that like ritual and ceremony was all this sort of just like manufactured dogma. And once we broke out of religion and into like a more secular world, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater and neglected to realize that like engaging in relatedness with people via rituals and ceremonies and symbols actually is like a really important part of living a healthy, fulfilled life. And it's not like, so like, you look at something like, like taking the Eucharist in like the Catholic Church, like drinking the blood of Christ, like it kind of went too far because, they were advocating that you're actually drinking the blood of Christ. And it's like,
Right.
and people kind of had a backlash that was like, that's just so anti-scientific. Like, I don't want any part of those kinds of rituals because they're entirely nonsensical. But the idea of like drinking something to pay tribute to people who have sacrificed before you, like there is merit to that. And, there is something important there, and that it will lead you to a feeling of groundedness that you won't have without ritual and without ceremony and without these things that connect you with a belief system, a moral belief system. So to your point, like, yeah, I mean, like I think there will be a huge reversion, man. I really do. I think the people's interest in living a more spiritual life will really start to grow over the next couple decades, because I think that people are largely lost right now. And I think, there's so much, I think like people are working primarily towards success. You see all these like things on YouTube, like how to be more successful, like 5 habits of more successful people. Like, and, everyone has a different definition of success, but you start to ask yourself, like, what are we even defining success as? That's just sort of like the prize that we've put at the horizon that everyone is, responsible for trying to move towards. But like, I think people will begin to ask themselves if that's the ultimate prize to chase after, and if there's not something internally, that's worth cultivating and spending time moving towards, internal development instead of an external sort of prize on the horizon.
Dude, those 5 ways to find success is not what's going to help humans evolve. Like, what's going to help humans evolve is us enhancing our relationship with Earth. It's going to require us to be more bold, to be a little bit more brash. It's going to be us making a commitment to actually get at the core of what needs to be engaged with. Otherwise, we're just going to stick and be stuck in our destructive presence. And part of that destructive presence is this clickbait, 5 ways to do this, 10 ways to do that. That's clickbait. That is destructive. That is not enhancing our relationship with Earth. I mean, look, like obviously we've been talking about this. People have been talking about this for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But it is really, 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 really time to bring the collective unconscious to the conscious, and let's start calling it the larger collective, and add this to the hashtag in it together. So COVID happened this year. One of the things that occurred was this in it together momentum and movement. It's a hashtag and this mentality. I think we can add to that, and that's how we all will rise. It will be how we get more equality. This is how we get countless shifts in perspective across millions of people, all of them beautiful. And this is how we're going to leave the planet more vibrant. That's how we're going to actually be able to thrive, survive, and evolve. Let me just ask you this to actually put a point and a pin on whether or not we're all connected. Have you ever caught yourself not doing, thinking, or feeling something?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do when I'm meditating, but it's very difficult. Yeah.
True. Okay.
Yeah.
The point
yeah.
is we're
Yeah.
connected because like there is this collective unconscious. It needs to be brought up, and we're part of a larger collective.
Totally, man. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I
But
think
you can really meditate to the point where you don't feel like you're doing, thinking, or feeling something.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's hard to sustain that feeling, but yeah, I mean, I think, we'll have to have like a larger series on consciousness, which is basically, in observing consciousness is an integral part of meditation. But yeah, I mean, when you're meditating, the idea is whether you think in like words or symbols, like no words, no symbols, like passing through your head. You're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about the future. Maybe you're counting, or maybe you're focusing on your
See, you're
breathing.
doing something. You're doing something.
Yeah, yeah. I try to stay away from that because I don't like any kind of like background signal. Like when
Mm,
I've had my most like powerful meditation sessions, it's just literally just like it's just like emptiness, like just total emptiness. I don't feel like I have a center either. I don't feel like I have a center in my head. I don't feel like I'm centered in my body. It's just like I feel like a void. And it's not, you wouldn't necessarily want to go through life like that 100% of the time because it would be impossible to get anything done in that mind state. But
right.
it's really cool to tap into when you can, and trying to trace back to that feeling when your emotions are really elevated helps kind of deflate whatever negative emotions you may be wrapped up in. So it's a not only like a novel exercise, it's a useful tool as well.
I love that. I need to be more aware in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. It takes some time to, I think, it takes some time to even know what you're looking for with meditation. And that's kind of why I think a lot of people try it and drop out, because it's not, if you're working out, it's like, okay, I'm trying to like drop pounds or like add muscle, you know exactly what the goal is. But with meditation, you're kind of, it's a little bit of a waiting game. You know what I mean? You kind of just
Right.
got to have faith that something useful will happen at some point if you stay at it.
Maybe we could talk about yoga and meditation at another episode. But just to wrap this one up, do you have
Mm-hmm.
any examples that you might want to share with people around them thinking about the collective unconscious? Like, help our audience make some connections. Like, I'll put one out there and see if you have something in response. This is from Chomsky in 1972. He thought about like universal grammar. How do we
Mm.
have an unconscious language processor that lets us decide whether a sentence is correctly formed? Like, doesn't that make you wonder that we're connected somehow in that type of sense of this larger collective unconscious? I wonder if you have some examples.
Totally, yeah. Well, uh, yeah, I think that is a really interesting example, and he was kind of, I think that's a great one that kind of connects between like the biological and the experiential. Like, he was saying we have like a biological capacity for language that leads to this sort of experiential capacity. So going back to the idea of like fear being a biological system in the brain, but it also being, a like psychological, very old psychological force that we're all beholden to. I think that your example with Chomsky is a great reflection of that. But one that I would share that I think is less about like the eternal forces in the collective unconscious, and more about how the collective unconscious of a certain people can kind of move in one direction altogether.
Mm,
Jung felt that the reason why the native German population, was so willing to kind of collectively persecute the Jewish people and other marginalized people was because, their kind of in their collective unconscious was an unrecognized shadow, and they were very happy to project the negative qualities within themselves onto the Jewish population. And that's that's what scapegoating is. Instead of, you take everything that you might not like about yourself, even if it's not like the defining features of yourself, but you take everything that is part of your personality that you don't like, and say this other group of people is the pure embodiment of those qualities. So we're totally pure and they're totally corrupted. And so like as a people, all of the collective unconscious of the native German population all kind of moved in that very sinister direction at the instruction and at the encouragement of Hitler. So I think I think it's important to be incredibly vigilant against those kind of big swings in the collective unconscious, because it can lead to a lot of people, like millions of people, participating in very evil behavior at the same time.
yeah, and as if like they forget that there is a uniform awareness that exists between us. And it's not just that their separate awareness is what it is. You know what I mean? Like their separate awareness and their ability to do that is actually tied to a uniform, larger awareness that exists within all of us. And it's like when you go down that negative route, it's like you miss that piece. And maybe that's our ego or their ego getting in the way of realizing that we are actually not the higher beings relative to other people, animals, or other ecosystems.
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely a big time ego trip. Yeah. Yeah, people would rather, to your point, divide the world into categories, and they tend to put, if you have like a political affiliation with 100% certainty, I would imagine you think that your political affiliation is in some sense superior to the alternative. Like, you're not going to be like, I'm a Republican, but I think Democrats are, more intelligent and more logical and more moral. Like, whatever camp you put yourself in, you're going to assume that is in a hierarchically privileged position relative to the other group. You think you're going to be, higher up the moral food chain. So yeah, and you can see how quickly everything dissolves when you start to realize that everyone is equal, and you're a little bit flawed, you're a little bit evil, they're a little bit flawed, they're a little bit evil. Like, a lot of people don't really want to go there because it starts to break down your whole worldview very quickly.
But again, like to really bring this all together, that is the importance of being able to double click into the icon or into the person and really understanding like we're similar in a lot of ways. And it's important that we make that type of connection. Otherwise, it's going to be tough to survive, in my opinion.
Totally. Yeah, totally. We're going to have to do it at some point.
Yeah, totally.
All right, man. Well, this was great talking to you, Arjun.
It always is, JB. And I want to say this was one of those episodes where I think if you really, really understand what we're talking about here, you will come out of this feeling like you matter. You are the reason the universe exists. You are worthy, and you are being acknowledged.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, I mean, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you double clicking into our own thinking. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to return the favor at some point, and hope you join us next time, next Monday, next Tuesday.
Peace.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Rising Laterally. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and were able to walk away with some new thinking that could help you in your personal or professional growth. Please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. And if you know of someone who could benefit from this episode, we'd love for you to pass it along. See you next week.